Born of the electronic age, the Cadillac Cyclone in its first public appearance. It's not a production car, but more of a rolling laboratory to test a score of new instruments, some clustered like the dashboard of a jet plane. A light touch, a lighted highway.
What happens when you hand the world's best automotive designers a blank check and tell them to build tomorrow? In 1950s and 60s America, we actually found out. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler went to war over the future, and what they built was unlike anything before or since. Let's get into it. To understand these cars, you have to understand the era. Post-World War II America was riding a wave of technological euphoria. The jet engine had just transformed warfare and aviation. The space race was underway. Chuck Yeager had broken the sound barrier. Nuclear power was being talked about as the solution to literally everything. And right in the middle of all this came the American automakers, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, each of them trying to answer the same question: what does the future look like? The answer, apparently, involved tail fins, bubble canopies, and turbine engines. These companies didn't just sketch ideas on paper, they actually built them. Full-scale, running, show-stopping machines, and sent them on tour across the country to see what the American public would think. Some of these concepts were functional cars. Others were elaborate props, gorgeous non-running display pieces that looked like they had just landed from another planet. Either way, the crowds went absolutely crazy for them. The philosophy behind all of this was surprisingly calculated. General Motors design chief Harley Earl, arguably the most influential automotive designer in American history, understood that you couldn't just sell people a car, you had to sell them a dream. And what better dream in 1955 than a jet-powered, chrome-covered, thin-adorned vision of tomorrow? General Motors launched what they called the Motorama, a traveling auto extravaganza that ran from 1949 through 1961. At its peak, these weren't just car shows, they were full theatrical productions, revolving platforms, orchestras, singers, dancers, and at the center of it all, cars that looked like nothing else on Earth. In 1956 alone, more than 2.2 million people walked through the doors. Over the entire run of the Motorama, GM welcomed roughly 10.5 million visitors. For context, that's more than the population of New York City at the time. The whole concept grew from Harley Earl's obsession with what he called dream cars. These were vehicles designed without the usual constraints of cost, production feasibility, or engineering practicality. As the Peterson Automotive Museum noted when they exhibited several Motorama cars, the designers considered these their best work precisely because they were working without limitations. They didn't have to worry about platform sharing, price targets, or whether the stamping plant could actually form the body panels. The cars could be anything their imaginations could conjure. And conjure they did. Some of the most radical concepts to ever roll on 4 wheels, or in one case 6, came out of this era. But before we get to the wildest examples, let's talk about the engine technology that made some of these concepts so genuinely revolutionary. If you wanted to understand what was driving the imagination of American engineers in the late 1950s and early 1960s, look no further than the jet turbine engine. Military aircraft had proven that the turbine was powerful, relatively simple compared to a piston engine, and incredibly smooth. So the question became, why not put one in a car? General Motors was the first American company to actually test a gas turbine-powered automobile in the United States. The vehicle was the Firebird I, introduced at the Motorama in 1953. And when I say it looked like a jet plane on wheels, I mean it almost literally. It had a single-seat cockpit under a glass bubble canopy, a bullet-shaped fiberglass fuselage, short wings, and a vertical tail fin running down the spine. The engine was a whirl-fired turbo-power gas turbine making 370 horsepower, spinning up to 13,000 RPM and exhausting gas at over 1,250 degrees Fahrenheit. The wings on the car weren't just styling, they had actual aircraft-style flaps for braking from high speed. GM never intended the Firebird I as a production car. It was a pure engineering exercise, an attempt to see if a turbine engine could even be made to work in an automobile. The results were promising enough to justify a sequel. The Firebird II arrived in 1956 with a more practical family car layout, seating 4 passengers in a titanium body. But the real crown jewel of the Firebird series was the 1958 Firebird III, and this one is worth spending some serious time on. The Firebird III was arguably the most technologically ambitious concept car ever built by an American automaker. Under those 9 fins, yes, 9, and that dramatic twin-bubble cockpit sat a 225-horsepower whirl-fired GT305 gas turbine spinning at 33,000 RPM. But the engine was almost secondary to what was going on with the controls. Harley Earl eliminated the conventional steering wheel entirely. The driver operated the car with a single joystick, what GM called the unicontrol, mounted between the 2 seats. Twist it one way to steer, push forward to accelerate, pull back to brake. That's it. Earl famously said he envisioned the Firebird III as a car a person might drive to the launching site of a rocket to the moon. The car also featured an ultrasonic key. Pointed at the door, and high-frequency sound waves would trigger the butterfly doors to open automatically. It had an early form of computer-controlled climate management, a prototype automated highway guidance system, and anti-lock brakes. In 1958, think about that for a moment, anti-lock brakes wouldn't appear on a production American car for nearly another 2 decades. The influence of the Firebird III on GM's production cars wasn't subtle either. The sculpted rocker panel tuck-under that defined the 1959 Cadillac, that came directly from the Firebird III's design language. So while this car never had a production run, its fingerprints ended up on millions of Cadillacs, Buicks, and Chevrolets in the years that followed. If GM's Firebird series was the boldest concept statement of the era, then Chrysler's approach was arguably the most courageous. Because Chrysler didn't just build a concept, they actually handed their turbine-powered cars to ordinary Americans and let them drive the things in the real world. The backstory begins in the early 1950s, when Chrysler started seriously developing gas turbine engines for automotive use. Through 7 successive generations of turbine development, they refined the technology until 1963 they felt confident enough to commission 55 special cars through Italian coach builder Carrozzeria Ghia. The bodies were built in Turin and shipped to Detroit for final assembly. The styling, overseen by design chief Elwood Engel, was sleek and futuristic without going overboard. A long, low, 2-door hardtop coupe finished in a metallic paint color called turbine bronze, roughly the shade of root beer. The interior carried through the turbine theme with bronze leather, deep pile carpet, and brushed aluminum accents. Under the hood, or more accurately, tucked into the rear, was Chrysler's A831 fourth-generation regenerative turbine engine producing 130 horsepower and a stout 425 pound-feet of torque. It had 80% fewer reciprocating parts than a conventional piston engine and could theoretically run on gasoline, diesel, kerosene, jet fuel, or even tequila. Chrysler actually demonstrated that last one. The engine connected to a standard torque-flight automatic transmission, which was one of the better transmissions of the era regardless of what was spinning it. What makes the Chrysler program unique in automotive history is what happened next. From October 1963 through early 1966, Chrysler loaned 50 of these cars to 203 ordinary Americans, men and women ranging from 21 to 70 years old, spread across 133 cities at absolutely no charge. The participants only had to cover fuel. In return, they gave Chrysler detailed feedback on what it was actually like to live with a turbine-powered automobile. The results were fascinating. Drivers loved the smoothness of the power delivery. The turbine engine was essentially vibration-free, and the exhaust note had an eerie jet-like whine that people found genuinely exciting. Maintenance requirements were minimal compared to a piston engine. On the other hand, the 8-step starting procedure tripped people up. Some users actually damaged their engines by getting the sequence wrong. Fuel economy was underwhelming, and acceleration, while adequate, didn't match the power numbers you might expect from a turbine. But here's the painful part of the story. When the program ended, Chrysler recalled all 50 cars and destroyed 46 of them. Today, only 9 Chrysler turbine cars survive. 2 remain in Chrysler's corporate collection, 6 are in museums across the country, including the Smithsonian and the Henry Ford, and 1 belongs to Jay Leno, who still drives it. The rationale for the destruction was primarily financial and legal. The Ghia-built bodies would have been subject to steep import taxes if they were sold domestically as used cars, and Chrysler had no interest in orphaned prototypes showing up on used car lots with mismatched engines stuffed in them. Still, watching footage of those cars going into a crusher is genuinely painful for anyone who loves automotive history. The estimated cost to build each car was somewhere north of $55,000, equivalent to well over $500,000 today. The turbine engine alone was cited at over $10,000 per unit to manufacture, compared to roughly $3,000 for an entire mid-range production car of the era. That cost gap, combined with emissions regulations that tightened through the late 1960s and 1970s, ultimately killed the program for good in 1979. Ford's answer to all of this wasn't a turbine car. It was something arguably even more ambitious. In 1962, at the Seattle World's Fair, Ford unveiled the Seattleite XI, a concept designed by Alex Tremulous, the same man who had designed the Tucker torpedo. And while it was only a 3/8 scale model rather than a full-size running car, the ideas packed into it were genuinely ahead of their time. The Seattleite had 6 wheels, 4 steerable ones up front arranged in pairs, 2 fixed ones in the rear. Ford's designers believed this configuration would dramatically improve tracking, traction, and braking. The car had no conventional steering wheel. Instead, it used fingertip-controlled steering. The dashboard replaced all gauges with a single centrally mounted screen displaying engine performance, road and weather conditions, and the car's position on a continuously updating map. In 1962, Ford was describing GPS and a digital instrument cluster 60 years before they became standard equipment. The powertrain concept was even more far out. The entire front section of the car was designed to detach from the passenger compartment, allowing the driver to swap out different power capsules depending on their needs. Need an economical 60-horsepower unit for city driving? Snap that one in. Heading out on a long highway run? Swap in a more powerful unit. The car even contemplated a compact nuclear propulsion device as one of those power options. Yes, a nuclear-powered automobile. In fairness, this was 1962, and nuclear power was genuinely being discussed as a solution to all energy problems. The Ford Nucleon, another Ford concept from 1958, had explored a similar idea. Whether it was ever practically achievable is a separate question. The name itself was a layered piece of wordplay: Seattle plus satellite plus Seattleite, with XI representing the 21st century the World's Fair was looking toward. Ford's design VP Gene Bordenot described the Seattleite as an exercise in unlimited speculation that could lead to genuine breakthroughs, and in hindsight, he wasn't wrong. Navigation systems, interchangeable power architectures, centralized driver information displays, all things that eventually became real. It's tempting to look at all of this and call it a circus, a lot of theatrical fantasy with no practical application, but that misses the real story. These concept cars were where American automakers tested ideas in front of real audiences and watched their reactions before committing to production tooling. The wraparound windshield that spread across the entire GM lineup through the late 1950s, first seen on the Buick LeSabre concept of 1951. The dramatic tail fins of the late 1950s and early 1960s production cars incubated across a whole generation of Motorama show cars. The rocker panel and body side sculpting that defined the 1959 Cadillac directly borrowed from the Firebird III. The Chevrolet Corvette itself, today one of the most iconic American sports cars in history, debuted as a Motorama concept car in 1953. The public response was so enthusiastic that GM fast-tracked it into production. Without the Motorama, the Corvette might never have existed. The Chrysler turbine car program, for all that it ultimately failed as a production proposition, produced engineering data on turbine reliability and fuel flexibility that still has relevance for modern research into turbine hybrid powertrains. The Seattleite XXI's vision of swappable power modules and integrated navigation systems describes the basic architecture of modern electric vehicles with remarkable accuracy. These weren't just show cars, they were engineering laboratories disguised as science fiction, and a surprising amount of what they imagined eventually showed up in real cars that real people drove. The next time you glance at your GPS screen, adjust your digital instrument display, or hear someone talking about swappable battery packs for electric vehicles, just know that somebody in Detroit was already thinking about that in 1962. Wearing a suit, standing next to a six-wheeled nuclear concept car at a World's Fair. That's the legacy of this era, and honestly, we haven't seen anything quite like it since. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments, which of these concepts do you think was the most ahead of its time? Put it down below.